Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, this is John Studi for the Lost Voice program, where we seek to recover the lost voice of Socrates, the lost voice of wisdom, which spoke to him 2,000 years ago in Athens. Today on the line we have Christopher Apodaca, and unfortunately Jacob Nelson is not with us, and so Professor Christopher Apodaca is going to be standing in for him as my guest co-host today. Chris, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, thanks, Jacob, for having your audience for them having to suffer through Chris in place of Jacob there today. And you know what, interestingly, I didn't know how to pronounce your last name until just now.
Okay, most people don't.
I thought you were Jonathan Stute for almost a year now.
Hey, my nickname for most of my life has been Studi, and I remember one time in 7th grade on the bus, there was a kid who I had been friends with for about 5 years, and he came up to me one day and said, "Studi, what's your last name?" So I told him Studi, and he was absolutely taken aback. He said, "Your parents named you Studi? What the heck is that? All about it's terrible." And they're like, "No, my first name's John." And he just about jumped out the window in terror. So anyway, Chris, tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, let me tell you about myself, aside from the fact that I didn't know how to pronounce your name. I'm a philosophy professor at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. I actually come from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I just moved out here in January, where I taught high school mathematics for 13 years. In college and right after college, I was involved in youth ministry, and here I am. This is me.
All right, fantastic. What got you interested in pursuing philosophy, going from a mathematics degree?
That's a good question. Actually, when I was in high school, I went to one of those Steubenville youth retreats.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what got me interested in Jesus in the first place. And I had a pretty profound, conversion experience, and that redirected my life significantly. I mean, at the age of 16, as significant as a redirection can be. But as a result of that, being the dork that I am, because I'm a uber dork, I started reading theology for fun.
Sure.
Yeah. And it's what we do. And it became a passion of mine. I became interested in apologetics, answering questions for Protestants, because my best friend was a Baptist.
Oh.
He didn't understand my attachment to things like praying to the saints and the Virgin Mary and things like that. And then when I got to college, I went to a painfully, terribly, awfully secular state institution. And I would like to say that, I enjoyed my time there, but I absolutely did not. It was kind of nightmarish for this young, Orthodox Catholic, stubborn, somewhat well-read for an 18, 19, 20-year-old. And I felt like I was having my faith attacked on a regular basis. And I'm pretty sure most of us can relate to that from our college experience if you went to a state school. So I started seeking out answers. I discovered C.S. Lewis, first of all, of course, as we all do, and his arguments for the natural moral law, the existence of God, Christianity, which eventually led me to Peter Kraft, who is a philosophy professor at Boston College, just about an hour and a half north of me.
Oh, wow.
And I'm sure a lot of you people in your audience are well acquainted with him. He's a popular speaker. He discusses philosophical and theological topics from a popular perspective, and of course through Peter Kraft discovered Thomas Aquinas, and eventually in my teaching career I hit this point where I said, well, you know what, I need to get a master's degree. What should I get my master's degree in? And first thought was, okay, career, I need to get my master's degree in education. And everyone said, well, that's a waste of time, don't do that. No insult to anybody who's got their master's degree in education, but that's just what everyone told me. And one of my friends finally said, Chris, you love philosophy, right? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, well, why don't you get your master's degree in philosophy? I said, well, I can't. UNM, University of Mexico, where I live, if I try to get a master's degree in philosophy there, it's going to destroy my soul. And they pointed out to me Holy Apostles online program, and the rest is history.
Well, there you go. It's actually not terribly dissimilar from my path, except that I grew up Protestant myself, grew up in a prosperity gospel church, name it and claim it kind of a thing. If you tithe your money and come to church and pray and love God enough and have strong enough faith, God will bless you with great material wealth and give you plenty of health to boot.
I'm sure you're very wealthy.
Desperately poor, actually. It was terrible.
Right.
Horrible. No, the ironic thing about it is, never mind. We don't need to get too far into that. But it was just a strange worldview, especially if you ever read the Gospels or looked into the early church, which was another odd thing. The church I grew up in was very insistent that they were just like the church in Acts. They were just like the early apostles, the early disciples. But if you look at the early church, they were very faithful. They shared everything in common, it says in Acts. But they were persecuted all the day long. They were constantly being slaughtered for the namesake of the Lord. Was their faith confession not powerful enough? I mean, what was going on there? And so there's just a number of issues that I had, even just on the face of it, when I started looking into the history of the church. And the biggest thing for me was again that the church I grew up in instilled in me a desire to be like the early church. And once I just started reading Ignatius of Antioch and Clement of Rome, the Didache, and all the other first couple centuries of Christian writings, I discovered very quickly that they were Catholic. And after about after a couple of years, I started thinking a little bit differently. But in terms of my own apologetics, it was me too. C.S. Lewis was the big one for me too. Although I ran into Lee Strobel before I ran into C.S. Lewis.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You had a question? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, who in particular directed you to the Church Fathers? Was there anyone in particular?
It was me, actually.
Oh, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, I had the crazy thought. Now, this was just insane, okay? So Jesus had disciples. But, dude, what if the disciples had disciples? Wow! And so I started Googling like crazy, and I found Introduction to Early Christian Writings, which is a Penguin Classics book, and forever changed my life.
That's interesting, because as a Catholic, we just kind of take that stuff for granted.
I know, it's so bizarre. My understanding of church history was essentially Jesus, the early apostles, the Book of Acts, Paul's missionary journeys, John dies, evil Catholicism, Martin Luther, who's only marginally better, and then, not Charles Taze Russell, who's the guy I'm looking for? John Nelson Darby comes up with a rapture in the mid-18th century. A couple of years down the road, we start getting into the Word of Faith ministries. Kenneth Hagin comes around, and then suddenly we've recovered the gospel. It's basically how I looked at things. And in particular, Pastor Mack had an insight that nobody else had. So. Right.
You got to get that T-shirt that says, "Dude, who started your church?" Right?
Yeah, I know. I've seen that one before. A couple of the youth at my home parish actually wear that one around. But Chris, I've got a question for you. How old are you?
36.
It's 30. Oh, I thought you were 35. Oh my gosh.
Well, you know what? I just had a birthday.
You did. And what did you do for your birthday?
I worked.
Hey, welcome to being a grown-up.
Being an adult, yeah. Creeping closer to eternity, and the more I do it, the more I work. So, but that's fine. Yeah. That's how the Lord's going to save my soul.
So one thing I've noticed on your Facebook feed is you've gone to Disney World like 3 times this year.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
No, you don't? Okay. I'm just terribly jealous.
This is I actually hadn't gone in years and years and years, and my parents decided to drive with me to Connecticut from New Mexico, where I'm from, as I moved out here. So kind of as a goodbye thing, we stopped at Disney World on the way. So it was kind of, we went a roundabout way to Connecticut, and then in March I found out that Connecticut's very cold. And New Mexico is not. So in March, when my family and friends were all enjoying 80-degree weather, we had a blizzard.
Oh my gosh.
Spring break came around, and I said, forget this, and I flew to Florida.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember that blizzard too. You messaged me on Facebook, or I messaged you, and you said you had about 4 feet of snow on your car.
Yeah. I couldn't dig my car out. Actually, I tried to dig my car out, and there was like an inch of ice under my car, so I stayed stranded for a couple of days, and I didn't like that too much.
Sure.
And so I found myself in Florida.
What's your favorite attraction at Disney World?
Ooh, you know what? My favorite attraction of Disney is actually in Disneyland, the Indiana Jones ride.
Oh, okay.
Best ride of all time.
See, I haven't been there. The biggest park I've ever been to is Worlds of Fun in St. Louis, Missouri.
Oh, okay.
And that was a blast. It's a lot better than Valley Fair up here in Minnesota, which is fine.
Right.
But once you really encounter higher quality roller coasters, Valley Fair really becomes a little bit drab.
Oh, sure.
So, anyway, so it's not just talking about John and Chris and their habits and the things that they do for fun and who they are, as interesting as we may be.
And I
think that we might want to talk about something a little bit more interesting, which is natural theology. And now, Chris, could you tell the audience real quick what exactly is natural theology? Because I know that when I first started looking into theology in general, I saw the term natural theology on a bookshelf once, and I thought, why would anybody need natural theology? What the heck does it even mean? So what is natural theology, and how is it distinguished from revealed theology like we have in Scripture?
Well, first off, you have to look at what the word theology means itself. It's a Greek word, obviously. It comes from theos and logos, meaning sort of the wisdom or the logic or the reason of God, or as we might translate it today, the science of God.
Sure.
So it's a systematic study of God is what theology is. Then you have two kinds of theology. You have revealed theology and natural theology. Revealed theology is what God grants us by the Holy Spirit through revelation to the church, scriptures, tradition, and the protection that God offers to that deposit of faith through the magisterium. Natural theology, though, doesn't depend on any kind of supernatural help from the Holy Spirit in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Natural theology is equally a study of God, but it's the study of what we can know about God purely from the position of natural reason. For example, we'd ask the question, can I prove the existence of God? And if I can prove the existence of God, what can I conclude from those proofs about his nature and about his relationship to the world? And so the major difference between natural theology and revealed theology is natural theology is a study of God from reason alone, whereas revealed theology is a study of God on the basis of faith in divine revelation.
Interesting. And this seems like a really important topic then that people should really start looking into. In my youth ministry experience, and also just if you look at the Pew studies and all the Barna studies, there is not so much necessarily a huge rise in atheism per se. It's still between like 4 and 10% of the world population as a whole, but atheistic ideas or atheistic approaches to reality are continuing to grow, and we're seeing the loss of faith, especially in younger people at a younger and younger age. In fact, there was recently a study that showed that people who go to public schools typically and lose their faith later in life will typically point to about 10 years old for when they started questioning the existence of God, or when they started saying that faith and reason are just totally incompatible.
Oh, yeah.
That's shocking.
It is shocking. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's in law school, and he told me that he made his final decision. He was an atheist at 14 years old, which struck me as very young to make that kind of life-changing decision.
Right.
And this is especially the case because his grandfather was an Eastern Orthodox priest. And it's interesting because he can't even wrap his mind around the idea of things like soul and God and non-material things. They just don't register for him on the radar at all.
Well, that's really interesting. Because I've seen that before, too, where I've had conversations with people who are atheists, and they just say, I just don't understand what it means to believe or have faith.
Yeah, they have no context.
Yeah, and because we've talked, you and I have talked about this personally before, how the body and soul are intimately intertwined. In fact, they're simply one substance. They're one thing. In the development around between 13 and 15 years old is really when your forebrain starts developing, and you start developing, gaining new abilities to think abstractly.
Sure.
And I wonder if there's anything to do with if you lose faith at that time and then don't practice the faith, that the necessary matter, or the matter that helps somebody conceive of faith, conceive of belief, or the soul, or God, or immaterial realities, is simply not developed well enough for the intellect to actually properly work through it.
Well, I mean, there are studies out there, and I don't want to make try to attempt to make a demonstrative argument based on this evidence, because there are many ways of explaining this data. But there are studies out there that indicate that atheists, there's certain parts of their brain that don't activate when thinking about questions of religion and spirituality, whereas for believers, those parts of the brain do activate during those types of discussions, which is, I mean, at least if nothing else, it's interesting. If nothing else, it's interesting. But what I find interesting about it too is that, you know, from my own personal experience, I remember raising those questions as young as first or second grade.
Right.
About, well, if God is real, what if God isn't real, first of all? And second of all, if he is real, how do we know we're worshiping the right one?
Yeah.
So, you know, whereas a lot of people, especially atheists, you know, on average get to these questions at 10, I was getting at these questions at a much, much younger age. Now I don't know if that means that there was something wrong with me, but the questions were there.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that too in my own youth ministry. I have a family who they're very faithful, they love the Lord, they're extremely involved, they're very bright, and their youngest son is constantly being assailed by his friends about, why do you go to church? Why do you believe in God? That's silly. And he's in second grade, for Pete's sake.
Oh my!
He is just being assaulted at school, and I wonder. And the interesting thing is, like I said, in public schools, it's the age of 10 is usually when somebody points back to the loss of faith. In Catholic schools, it's only marginally better. We lose them in 8th grade, which is what I'm seeing also by working in a Catholic school as well, and working closely with the middle schoolers there, seeing the loss of faith at that time. And I had a similar experience. I asked a lot of questions. I was a public schooler. In 10th grade is when I started really questioning God's existence. And there was a number of other contributing factors to that decision and that questioning. But it was just like a lot of people at that 10-year-old age. And even if they don't become atheists, usually they seem to fall into this position that sociological researcher Christian Smith says, who's one of the foremost experts on sociology and religion. He calls it moralistic therapeutic deism. Have you heard of that term before?
I've heard the term before, yeah. I think it's a witty term, by the way.
It's a very witty term, and we've talked about it a couple times on the show, so there's no need to get too deeply into it. But I think that part of the problem for both Catholic schools and for public schools, especially when kids go to religious education in the Catholic parish, is that we've seriously lost the Catholic intellectual tradition. We just don't teach the faith. In fact, it's almost a Catholic school or a Catholic religious ed program is one of the worst places to find a compelling case for the Catholic belief, the Catholic worldview. I've seen so many people turned off by it.
Yeah, Catholic schools, Jesus is just about being nice, right?
Yeah, Jesus is about being nice. You can't think too hard about it because it becomes impersonal.
Who don't want you to be nice too?
Yeah. What is that supposed to do? I mean, how is that transformative? We all know that we need to be nice. C.S. Lewis said it great, that Christianity is not about making mean men nice or bad men good. It's about making dead men come alive. And we simply are not doing that, either through our actual evangelistic efforts in trying to help people come to know the person of Jesus Christ and love them with their heart and transform them in their heart and make their dead hearts come alive. But also we're dead intellectually to God because we haven't allowed His truth to penetrate into our minds, and we don't spend the time to stop and contemplate on His goodness, contemplate on His beauty.
Well, there's the danger of only doing one or the other. I've seen both, you know. You can talk about dogma all day long, but if you don't evangelize the people to whom you're talking, it's dead. There's no point about it. But you can also talk about how happy, clappy, love you, Jesus, how much Jesus loves you, but not give people the truth, and that's not going to save their souls either. You know, you need to put young people in front of the Blessed Sacrament as much as possible, but you also need to tell them the truth and answer their questions, because they have good questions. We don't need to treat them like they're stupid. They have good questions that deserve good answers. And it's not just Catholic schools, but even in the public schools, in the Catholic schools, we lose the Catholic intellectual tradition. In the public schools, we've lost the Western intellectual tradition, the canon of Western thinkers that we don't cover anymore, that don't allow for people to even begin to ask these questions or even suggest that there might be rational answers to these questions.
Yeah.
People don't know there was a Thomas Aquinas or even a Descartes, who, I don't think is the greatest philosopher in the world, but if people don't know these thinkers existed, then the idea that there might be rational answers to their critical questions is never a reality for them.
Yes, absolutely, and that's a huge problem, because if we aren't relying or we aren't falling back on the truths of the people who have come before us, in a lot of ways it's like we're starting from scratch, which is the really interesting thing that I've been seeing with a lot of my friends who are interested in philosophy is they really seem like a lot of the pre-Socratics. They're often materialists, or they fall under some sort of monism, or they're people who will subscribe to a relativistic understanding of things. I forget who it was, but a pre-Socratic once said something along the lines of, whatever seems is true.
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember who said that, but that seems like the place that we're getting to in our intellectual tradition is like we've thrown away the last 2,500 years of discovery and advancement in our philosophy, whereas we're doing great with our empirical sciences, but when it comes to understanding nature as nature, we've practically abandoned the pursuit.
Well, it's the same problem. Religions that reject the authority of the church, everybody has to become their own pope, right? Yeah, a person who rejects the philosophical conversation that's been going on for 2,500 years, they have to become their own Socrates and start over again. And that's a lot of work. No individual person can recapitulate and reproduce 2,500 years of philosophical investigation. You just can't do it. You have to go back and look at what's done before you, because some of those questions have already been addressed for you.
And I hate saying this because my American egalitarian tendencies lead me away from it, but not everybody's cut out for philosophy.
That is so true.
Not everybody's cut out for theology, even worse. I
think everybody can have some kind of cursory, understanding and some cursory exposure to it. But you're right, not everybody is well suited to it.
Which is fine. I mean, I think we're all allowed to think about the deeper truths of the reality, and we need to think through our lives in terms of ordering their decisions and our actions according to reason, like Aristotle talks about in the Nicomachean Ethics. But that doesn't mean that we have to get into metaphysics. It's extremely difficult. Or even into theology, which can be even more difficult. I mean, heck, I've been trying to work on my understanding of divine simplicity recently, and then diving into how does divine simplicity accord with the Trinity, and having to make the distinctions between subsistence and suppositum and substances, and all these other terms that I didn't even know existed before now. Holy cow! It's difficult.
I'm actually doing research on the same topic right now too. And this is probably one of the most profoundly complicated topics there are. So you're right. It's not something that you're going to be able to learn easily. It's something that takes decades, of work.
Sure. And then one thing that is also interesting is that natural theology can also be supplemented by revealed theology. Not so much that revealed theology necessarily takes the place of natural theology, but it's like looking at the answers in the back of the math book, where you can look forward and then you can see how you got there and how it makes sense.
That's exactly what I teach my students in my philosophy class. We talk about nature. Yeah, we talk about medieval philosophy. You always have to talk about the nature, the relationship between revealed theology and philosophy. And I always say we have this benefit as Christians, as Catholics, that we have true theology, so we have those answers in the back of the book. So if we make a mistake, we can always go back and see, hey, what step in my reasoning did I make that mistake on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one interesting thing, too, is that, and I just wrote a paper that touched on this subject, is that in one of Aquinas' lesser-known works, which is De Ente et Essentia, or on being in essence, he makes an argument from the distinction between essence and existence. And if I'm not mistaken, he gets there because he talks about separated intelligences, like angels, still having potency. And he makes the distinction between potency and act within it by saying that the essence of the angel is distinct from the existence of the angel or the human soul, which is also an immaterial, has an immaterial subsistence. So you look at that distinction there too. Well, could you talk on that a little bit? I think that was your thesis, right, for your master's degree?
Yeah, my thesis, my master's thesis was on that very topic. So the basic gist of it is the following. God is the conserving cause of all things. God continually holds all things in existence. All of created things, correlatively, are being held in existence by God. So what we'd say is all created things are contingent. They don't have to exist, and because they don't have to exist, they have to be held in existence or preserved. God, on the other hand, is necessary. He has to exist by his very nature. He is an essentially existing being. So what does that mean in regard to essence and existence? Well, essence of a thing is its nature, its form, its whatness, its quiddity. If I talk about the essence of humanity, I mean a rational animal. If I talk about the essence of a triangle, I say three-sided polygon. Well, in created things, there's a real difference between their essence and their existence. Meaning, it's not part of their essence, it's not part of their definition, it's not part of their nature that they have to exist. They're contingent. Because there's a difference between their essence and existence, they're contingent. But God, as a necessary being, as we said before, has to exist. So he can't possess any of the qualities of a contingent, non-necessary being. So he can't possess, there can't be a distinction in him between his essence and his existence.
Sure. God's
essence and existence are the same thing. What that means, what the upshot of that is, God's definition, or we can't really define God, but what God is existence. We might say that, Jonathan, you and I have being.
Sure.
And so there's a cause or an explanation for why we have being. But God is being. He doesn't need a cause because he is being. There's no need to explain why he has it or doesn't have it. He just is it. And so that's just the basic idea behind the essence and existence distinction. In my thesis, I address two philosophers who have different ways at arriving at the essence-existence distinction. I said they're both wrong, and I have a better answer.
Now I'm more interested. You sent me your thesis, didn't you?
Yeah, it was, I don't know, it was back in the day when I wasn't as good a writer as I am, so I'm going to have to rewrite that someday.
All right, well, I'll have to look at that, because I'd be interested in seeing how you thought they were wrong. I just picked up Gavin Kerr's book, who's a philosopher out of Ireland, and it's called Aquinas' Way to God. He actually writes on the fourth way, and so I'm looking forward to getting through that finally. I haven't really got to read a whole lot with finals and life, but
oh yeah, no, I understand.
In either case, was that
a pile of term papers right now? So
oh, it's terrible, isn't it? I'm looking forward to being a professor someday. I know I am. I promise myself I am.
Good for you.
But that, to a lot of our listeners, may have sounded really abstract and difficult.
I was thinking the same thing. But that's a good point, though, what we're saying about how difficult philosophy can be.
Yes, absolutely. And that doesn't mean that people aren't capable of understanding many of the arguments for God's existence. In fact, there's a number of them that are very easy to understand that have been really floating around in popular, mostly evangelical apologetics for the last 20 years or so, who the foremost apologist, I think, is Dr. William Lane Craig, who presents a number of arguments in his debates, which are fairly easy to get. And those are like the Kalam cosmological argument, the design argument, and the moral argument. And I've been able to use these myself in fairly quick engagements with atheists or people who have a question about God's existence, or even I've broken down the moral argument so that middle schoolers can understand it. Which the moral argument, for those of you who have not heard it before, or at least the way that I formulate it, is if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values or duties. However, we find in this world that there are objective moral values and duties, which means that atheism is false. However, or not true, which is false. However, if atheism is false, then at least some sort of theism must be true. Therefore, a God exists. Yeah, some sort of God exists. So we need to believe in some sort of source for our moral ontology, our moral experience. And there's a number of ways that I support those various premises. But what's been interesting is in all of my debates, all of my arguments, all the presentations I've given, for some reason, this moral argument has been the most effective at converting people. In fact, I had an opportunity once. I used to do some street preaching, and as a Catholic, interestingly enough, at the University of Minnesota campus on the Minneapolis side with a friend of mine. And I remember having a conversation with a student there, and he started off, I'm an atheist, there's no good arguments. And then I presented that Socrates syllogism that I talked about before, and I said, if I can do that with God, do you think that we've come to a very good argument for God's existence? And he said, yes. And so we did this Socratic dialogue, a bit of back and forth, and at the end of it, we got to the conclusion that therefore God exists. Right. And he looked at me and said, that's a strong argument. God exists. And then he just, it's like, he said, time for lunch though, I'm so sorry, let's talk later. And so he walked off, and that was it. And it was amazing. I've only seen like an instantaneous conversion a few times in my life, particularly through argumentation.
Of course, we wonder how long it stuck with him, right?
Yeah, that's the other question, too. I gave him some resources in my email address. He never got back to me personally, but perhaps he at the very least looked at some of those resources. But as St. Paul says, as Jesus says, one sows, one waters, and God reaps the harvest. And so my hope and my prayer is that he does come around to embracing the fullness of Christian truth. Of those arguments, has any of those actually really appealed to you at all?
Well, I actually, I was going to say I like the moral argument for one specific reason. It's existential import. Yeah. Now, that's a fancy term, so I'm going to explain what that means. It speaks to our personal, subjective human experience. The design argument, the Kalam argument, Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, at least purport to all be very scientific. They're approaching things from a very objective, observer, science-oriented perspective. Mm-hmm. But the moral argument appeals to us as human beings in the way we live our lives. And I think you and I were talking about this earlier. Most people aren't convinced to follow God or believe in God by reason alone. We're not angels. We're convinced by something internal, something that, von Hildebrand called the heart, that affective dimension where there's emotion and desire and appreciation for love and beauty. And I think the moral argument hits there because it's in that central core of our being that we have an idea, even if we haven't rationally worked it out, that there's such a thing as right and wrong.
Right.
And C.S. Lewis appeals to it in Mere Christianity. He's like, look, we all know what's right and wrong, and we argue about it. And he says, we don't argue about things that are just matters of taste. We don't say, oh, I like Big Macs. Oh, I don't like Big Macs. You're wrong. I'm right. That's just not how we talk about things. We only argue about things for which we think there are objective answers.
Right.
And the reason we argue about morals is because we believe deep down that there's such a thing as an objective moral law. So on that level, I think it appeals to us in a more persuasive way than other arguments do. Now, on a certain level, it's a more difficult argument because if someone's truly a radical skeptic, they may not believe there's such a thing as right and wrong. And so we have to do a lot more work first to show that there is such a thing. Mm-hmm. But on the surface of it, if we're just talking about persuasion, rhetoric, appealing to people as people, I think the moral argument is the strongest in that way.
Yeah, I think so too. I've had some pretty good success with Thomas's first and second way as well, and interestingly enough, his fourth way has become one of my favorites that I want to do a lot more research on. But my biggest issue with the Kalam cosmological argument, the design argument, And even most especially, possibly the moral argument is that it only gets us to a vague theism, which when you heard me formulate the argument from morality, from the existence of moral truths, it only brought us to some sort of God exists. Sort of. It could be a pantheon to gods.
It could be many.
Yeah, it could be. And to get it any further, I think that you really have to appeal to something like Thomas's fifth way to bring us to a God that's intelligent and that's one and that's pure actuality, that doesn't change, that's a creator of the universe, etc.
Completely distinct from all of the plane of creation in which we exist.
Yes. And that's where, like, even the Kalam cosmological argument as well, Craig, at the end of many of his arguments, and anybody else who follows in his style, will say that, if the Kalam cosmological argument is essentially whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence, and then he starts getting into these divine attributes. If space, time, and matter began at the Big Bang, then they didn't exist before, and therefore whatever was the cause of the Big Bang has to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and unimaginably powerful.
Yeah, it's that last term when he says unimaginably powerful that gets him, because that's not quite the Christian God now, is it?
No, it's not. Well, even the other ones, too, and this is one of the issues that I've been seeing with a number of arguments that are used in popular apologetics, or even some of the things with particular inter-Catholic disputes, that they're based off of an imperfect syllogism, because with the Kalam cosmological argument and jumping to the divine attributes, what he's doing is he's not arguing from the essence of God himself, but he's arguing from the necessary conclusion of what happens if there is no matter, space, or time before the Big Bang. And so if there's no matter, space, or time, then whatever else before it was immaterial, spaceless, timeless, or whatever. It's not necessarily pointing to God. It's pointing to something other than God, and then drawing the conclusion to its opposite, which isn't as strong for me. Which I think leads me to why I really started enjoying Thomas's arguments, and the first time I ever really encountered them with any depth was through Edward Fazer's book, although I had seen it through Peter Kreeft. And even though Peter Kreeft is fantastic, and he's a great author and a very good popularizer of philosophy, sometimes he gets things a little bit off. In his course in the Modern Scholar series, he talks about the first way as like a finger that knocked a domino over. Or Craig is another great philosopher, and he claims to have trained under a Thomist. In his analysis of the fourth way, what he says about the fourth way is he basically says this is a moral argument for God's existence, which is not the case at all.
Not even a little bit.
And so why is it that even great philosophers like Peter Kreeft and William Lane Craig can get Thomas's arguments so wrong?
Well, and I'll mention Kreeft too, because I've seen some other mistakes he makes in his Summa of the Summa, which is commentary on parts of the Summa Theologiae. Mm-hmm. He characterizes the fifth way as the design argument, kind of like William Paley's argument, and it most certainly is not anything like William Paley's argument. It's an argument from final causes, not an argument from design, which is a metaphysical proof. Mm-hmm. Paley's argument is a probable argument from analogy. The world kind of looks like a designed watch, so since it kind of looks like a designed watch, and the designed watch has a designer, the world probably has some kind of designer too. That's a probable argument. Thomas Aquinas' argument is there has to be some intelligent sustainer of the being of all things who is existence itself and unlimited in every way. Different kinds of arguments. Why do they get it wrong? I think to some degree is they don't enter into fully into the thought of Thomas Aquinas. One of the dangers in reading the five ways, and this is why I would caution people not to just jump into Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. That's his famous summary of all theology, in which contains a great deal of philosophical work within it. And in early on in the Summa Theologiae, Thomas offers 5 proofs of the existence of God. Mm-hmm. And the reason I would caution people from jumping right into those is they're going to take all kinds of modern assumptions about what Thomas's words mean into the argument, and they're going to completely miss the boat on what Thomas is arguing.
Mm-hmm.
We see this most embarrassingly in the case of the New Atheists when they read Thomas's writings. Richard Dawkins is a great, a perfect example of this. He spends a few pages thinking he has refuted Thomas's 5 ways. He hasn't even addressed Thomas's 5 ways. He's addressed what he thinks Thomas's 5 ways are, and he's completely wrong. So I would caution most people. I'd say if you're going to begin a study of natural theology, especially the arguments of Thomas Aquinas, you need a guide, and that guide can either be a teacher, a professor, someone who knows a lot about philosophy, or a book like Edward Fazer's great summary called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. You need something to help you, otherwise you're going to make the mistakes that even brilliant philosophers like William Lane Craig and Peter Craig make.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any, besides that, one of the things I'd say about Fazer's book is that it is difficult, especially for somebody who has had absolutely no introduction to philosophy whatsoever. Is there a book that you'd recommend for somebody who hasn't had a lot of exposure to philosophy in their life?
Yeah, it's tough. I think Fazer was the first one that really helped me to begin, so I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself here for a second.
All right.
But just to get your mind wrapped around the way of thinking philosophically about natural theology, I would suggest that Peter Craig's shorter handbook of Christian apologetics is okay.
Okay.
Because at least on a very surface level, it gets you to begin to understand how one thinks about proving the existence of God. And for the most part, like you and I said, Craig is pretty good, actually. So, he's not going to, drive you too off in the wrong direction. And it's pretty simple work. And then from there, you could probably move on to Edward Fazer's book. Interestingly, I'm gonna be a self-promoter here right now.
Oh, right, yeah. Okay, go on. I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, I'm actually editing and rewriting a book the 2 professors that I know worked on called
Catholic Realism.
Catholic Realism, yeah. And so my name will be, once I finish, on the front as either an editor or co-author of that book. And I'm hoping to present the 5 ways in a manner that's simple enough that most people can have an idea of what we're saying.
Right. And I hope so, too. Maybe I can help you read through that and critique it with my simple mind. If I can read it, anybody else can as well.
I don't know. You're light years ahead of where I was at your age, so...
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Especially considering, I don't know, I only really started even thinking about thinking in the last 5 years or so. I don't know what was wrong with me before that. Why did I start on this earlier? Too late if I love thee, O Lady Wisdom.
Yeah.
Look at that, spinning Augustine. The one I'd recommend for our listeners is Michael Agros, Robert Agros being his father, Michael Agros's Who Designed the Designer. It is an awesome book. And what it does is it presents all of Thomas's 5 ways individually, but shows the common thread through each of them in one of his concluding chapters. And he presents Thomistic philosophy to you in such a way that you don't know that you're doing it. You miss it. And it just seems so natural. And he even gets into divine attributes as well. And he does an absolutely beautiful job on it. The only chapter I didn't like a lot was his chapter on the 5th way, which seemed to kind of blend Pele's argument with Thomas's argument from Final Causes.
Mm-hmm. This is a common problem.
Yeah, but it can be a problem, but it's not so much like outright equating the two. But he uses elements of Pele's, if I'm remembering this correctly, it's been a while since I've read it. He uses elements of Pele's argument to support Thomas's conclusion.
Right.
So I'll have to read it again. The first time I read through it, it was like a week, and it was maybe the second philosophy thing I'd ever read, and it was while I was going to the Augustine Institute. But overall, I'd say that book is one of the best ones at the popular level that I've ever seen. So maybe you could check that out when you're doing research for your own book.
Absolutely.
Do you have a favorite way for God from Aquinas' 5 ways?
Yeah, I do, actually, because I think it's the simplest, and I think it's the most direct, and I think it's the least open to objection.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts like this. You have a bunch of things in the world that have being, right? This is Thomas' second way. Why do they have being? That's the question Thomas asks. Why do they have being? Because it's possible for them not to have being, because they come into existence and they go out of existence. So why do they have being? Well, Thomas says if it's a question of why they have being, then they have to be caused, or there has to be an explanation of why they're being held in being at any given moment. So, why is the phone on my desk exist? What is the explanation right here and right now for why this phone exists right here and right now, rather than doesn't exist? And Thomas says, well, it has to be a cause. He says, okay, well, let's look at the cause of my phone, whatever that might be. I don't want to get into the specifics, but the cause that's holding my phone in existence. Does it have being? Is it something that could maybe be or not be? If the answer is that cause could possibly not be, then it too needs a cause. Hold it in existence right here and right now. And then Thomas goes on to say, well, we could keep asking this question forever, but eventually we have to get at some primary source of existence, a fundamental cause that's preserving this chain of causes and effects in existence right here and right now. Well, why do we have to get to this fundamental cause? Well, he says, consider, for example, a staff. And we'll make it even more complicated than Thomas is making it. Let's say you have a rock that's being moved by a stick. The stick is being moved by a hand, and the hand is being moved by the mind, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All of these things, the motion of the rock is continuously dependent on the motion of the staff, which is continually dependent on the motion of the hand, which is ultimately dependent upon the motion of the mind.
Sure.
What we would say is that the staff and the hands represent what we call instrumental causes. They're not able to activate themselves on their own. Anytime that they're active, anytime that they're causing, anytime that they're doing anything, they have to be activated by something else. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, you can't have just instrumental causes. You can't have an infinite series of instruments. And Thomas says, here's the reason why. Consider a staff. Doesn't matter how long the staff is. You can keep making the staff longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. You can make the staff infinitely long if you want. I don't know what an infinitely long staff would look like, but you could make the staff infinitely long. Even if the staff was infinitely long, could it move itself? The answer is no. It would need some kind of non-instrumental cause, what we call a first cause or a fundamental cause, to engage it. Mm-hmm. Another way to look at this is a series of cogs in a machine, right? A cog's in a clock. One cog moves another cog, moves another cog, which moves another cog. Even if there were an infinite number of cogs, when any of those cogs move, if there wasn't a motor keeping them in motion? No. The motor is what we call a first cause or a fundamental cause. It's the same thing with existence. If one thing is holding another thing in existence, it's holding another thing in existence, even if there was an infinite number of these things, you'd still need a fundamental cause activating them all, holding them all in existence. Well, one of the characteristics of all these instrumental causes in between is each one of them has being, which means they could either exist or not exist. Either one of those options is open to them. That means the fundamental cause can't be something that merely has being. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we'd have to ask what caused it. If that were the case, it wouldn't be a fundamental cause. So we have to say this fundamental cause doesn't have being. This fundamental cause is being. It is being itself. Or as Thomas would say, subsisting existence. That's a technical word for it. You don't have to memorize that, but it's being itself.
So there's going to be no quiz on this?
No.
Okay, good, because I've been blank. I've been staring off in the abyss for a while. Just joking. Keep going.
Me and Jonathan share a common problem. We both have ADD, and we were wondering if we were going to be able to get through this conversation.
But miraculously, we're doing great.
Yeah, we are. We're doing okay. Keep it up. This is divine grace. All right. So this fundamental cause has to be being itself, which means it can't be limited in any way, because if you limit it in any way, you've introduced non-being, and then it wouldn't be being itself. So that means it's not limited in any way. That means it's infinite, possesses every perfection. If it possesses every perfection, it can't be changing because there's nothing lacking, and therefore nothing which it can change into. It can't be. I lost my train of thought. See, this is what happens. The ADP comes in. It has to be
derailed, and there's no survivors.
There's no survivors. Oh, it has to be eternal because if time only makes sense in terms of changing things. And as you see, as we're starting to sculpt what this being comes out to be, you're talking about the God of classical theism, we say, or the God of the Christian faith, an absolutely unlimited, transcendent being who is not like any of the other beings we just discussed. He's absolutely beyond them, because all of those other beings merely have being, but what we're talking about is something that is being itself, so completely unique and beyond all of the contingent created things in the world. So that's my favorite proof of the existence of God. It can be broken down and made simpler, but that's my favorite.
Right. Well, I like that one quite a bit too. In fact, between that and the first way are two of the ones that I presented to larger audiences in my youth ministry efforts, and they've been both very successful, both the first and the second way, but the second way has stuck with kids a little bit more, and I think has caused a little bit more wonder. Mm-hmm. The one argument that I think doesn't really get quite as much press because of its difficulty and its strangeness in the Summa is the argument from gradation of perfection, which is called the fourth way. And this one, when I first encountered it, it was actually through reading Richard Dawkins, which was very unfortunate.
His refutation of the fourth way is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. And this is what drove me nuts, too. When I read his refutation of the fourth way the first time, I had no idea that Thomism was still a school of thought. I didn't even think there were different schools of thought in philosophy. And so I looked up people's responses to Richard Dawkins' refutation, and they were just as bizarre. And I'll get to those in a second here. But the fourth way, if I'm going to say it as quickly as I possibly can, in terms of its syllogistic structure, then I'll try to put it together. Aquinas basically observes that some things are more or less true, good, noble, and the like, but more or less are predicated or said of different things according to how much they resemble a maximum. And whatever is the maximum in any genus is the cause of all others in that genus. Therefore, there must be something which is the cause of all beings and the cause of their goodness and every other perfection, and this is what we call God. Thank you. What the heck does that even mean? Richard Dawkins said, in response to this, "What? That's an argument? Well, some men's feet are smellier than others. Therefore, there must be some preeminent stinker which is the cause of all stinkiness in the universe. That doesn't make sense. How could he possibly say that? I hesitate offering this strong of a criticism because of Thomas's eminence, but really?" Basically, that was his argument, almost verbatim.
When I read it, I fell out of my chair because I knew something about Thomas at that point.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and the guy... Sidetrack. One thing that drives me nuts, drives me up the wall, is often when we dialogue with atheists, especially really strong, skeptical atheists, they require for the existence of God, like a jar that's opened up that shows them the butterflies of God's existence or whatever, some sort of empirical, undeniable sensory experience of God. And even then, it's still amazing.
They expect that you can be able to measure the length of God and the height of God and width of God, and then you put them in a petri dish and study him. And you can cut off a chunk of God and study it in a petri dish.
Yeah, exactly, and then replicate God somehow, because that's how science works.
And predict what God's going to do.
Yes, which is, well, we can kind of do that, but only in a relative sense by studying nature. But anyway, different topic. We'll get to that later. But or when they talk about Jesus in the Gospels, I'll believe that Jesus said what he said and did what he did in the Gospels when you show me video evidence and bring me back in time so I can watch it with my own eyes, etc., etc. But then, whenever Christmas or Easter rolls around, there's always those people, Easter's really the celebration of Ishtar, the Babylonian fertility goddess who...
Oh, yeah. Regardless of the fact there's no evidence for that.
There's zero evidence. And then so you ask them, okay, what kind of evidence do you need to believe that? Well, the answer is one dank meme. Really? That's it. Anyway, side discussion over. But Richard Dawkins is the same way. I mean, he is absolutely convinced or absolutely adamant that there is no evidence for God. Where is the evidence? Where is the evidence for your beliefs? And then he believes that kind of stuff, and then he doesn't do any research.
I don't think he thinks that. To be honest with you, as brilliant as a scientist as he is either. Here's my argument: either he is not very smart, or he's very dishonest.
Right.
And he's obviously very intelligent because he's a PhD scientist, brilliant geneticist. So I think he's dishonest. I think he purposely misrepresents the arguments of theists to score rhetorical points, and that's what he's doing.
Yep, and I think that is the genius of the new atheism, is that it very quickly and very easily grew itself onto new media and was able to put things in a soundbite format that sounded appealing, that sounded witty, that sounded, what's the word I'm looking for? Scandalous. Something people would be attracted
to. Yeah, definitely.
We all want those kind of things. I mean, we all like other people's dirty laundry.
Yeah, and atheism is very sexy right now.
Oh, it's very sexy. But the responses to Dawkins on the Fourth Way that I found were even stranger. I don't remember exactly who all the different philosophers were, but I remember one, his response to it was, well, yeah, Aquinas is using Platonic arguments here. And then what he's saying is that, yes, all the attributes exist perfectly in the mind of God.
Right.
And the attributes only are the way they are because they're participating in the perfect form. So it's kind of this Neoplatonist thing. So stinkiness exists in God.
Right.
Okay, that makes it sound ridiculous.
Yeah. Never mind the fact that Aquinas isn't a Platonist.
Yeah. There's something to that, I think. Although, interestingly, there's something sort of similar to this argument in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. But there is. Maybe we can talk about that a different day here.
Yeah.
But when I looked at this argument, and especially as I studied it through people like Michael Agros and my professor Christopher O. Bloom at the Augustine Institute, it made a whole lot of sense to me, especially through understanding the transcendentals, which is what Aquinas is talking about when he says good, true, noble, and the like. When he says and the like, he's referring to certain things, and especially later when he says, which is due to all beings as a cause of their being. And then his reference to metaphysics, too, indicates to us what his starting position is. And he is talking about the transcendentals. And for those of you who don't know, the transcendentals are ways of speaking about being itself. In some way, all things that exist are good, they're true, they're one, they're a thing, they're of this, and they're noble. And some will argue beautiful. And nobility is considered a transcendental because if you think of it like the nobility of an aristocrat, they're separate, they're different from the people around them. They're at a higher level. And so when Aquinas talks about nobility, he's talking about a hierarchy of being within the universe. There are some things that are greater than others.
Right.
And we can think about this, and Edward Fazer offers an excellent example or an excellent metaphor, speaking of a triangle. A triangle that's drawn with a radiograph pen and a protractor on graph paper is going to very closely approximate the form of a triangle, the essence of a triangle, which is a three-sided closed-plane figure which has interior angles equaling 180 degrees. But if my son, who is 21 months old, very smart, by the way, can count to 10 already.
Is he already drawing triangles?
He's basically reproducing Pythagoras.
Wow.
Just saying.
I expect nothing less.
Drawing circles. Hey, I know, especially considering his mother.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, considering the source.
Yeah, exactly, his mother. But if my son were to draw it, and he was riding on my back because, that's what dads do, and he was drawing it with his crayon on a piece of paper on the back of my head while I'm running full gallop, it's not going to be a very good triangle. It just won't be. It won't really approximate to what it means to be a triangle. And so we can see through this that there is a relation between a good triangle, which is going to be one that it closely approximates or comes nearer to what it means to be a triangle, and a bad triangle, which can still be a triangle, like my son draws. And now in the same way, we see that in our natural world as well. You have rocks, or the basic elements, which just kind of do the thing that they do. Rocks are heavy and they're pulled towards the ground under Thomas's understanding of things, and so are the other basic elements like iron. But once we start moving up the scale of being, we come to things like plants, which not only are pulled to the ground, which is common to all bodies, or pulled to the nearest center of gravity, if you want to call it that, like all bodies are, but it also has the ability to take things through nutrients up into itself and create it into itself, which is a wonderful thing. But the plants just generally stay there. They don't seek out. They don't find new things. They don't interact with the world around them too much. But animals, on the other hand, they do. They have self-motion. They can reproduce just like plants can. They're also sensitive. They feel the world around them, and they have a certain, especially among the higher animals, certain level of cognition where they can start calculating their actions. And then we get even further with humans, which not only can do all the things that animals and plants can, but we can go one step further, which is true intellection, where we understand the universal natures of things. And so like plants taking on immaterial substances and transforming it into itself, we, in a way, find the universal essences of things and bring them into our own being, which is why Aristotle says that a man, in some ways, is all things. Right. And so throughout this process, what we're seeing this hierarchy of more intensely existing things. But as you were saying before regarding on being in essence, anything that exists in a particular way or in a way that is
limited
not limited, that's limited, exists, has that existence only because it's being caused to be through another. And the way I like to think about this is like if you had a fireplace in your house, right? A person comes in, you open up the door, it's warm in the front room, but not really warm. But you keep walking through the house, and you notice each room is getting warmer and warmer and warmer. But you also know that room's air temperature is, 76 degrees or whatever? It's not usually this warm, and you start sweating by the time you get to the back of the house. And you keep searching for the source of the heat. Why is each room hotter than the other? And eventually, you find out that you're in flames, which is the problem. But at the very least, you've discovered the source of this heat. Fire. Fire has heat in itself. And so in the same way, we have this hierarchy of beings which participate in existence, which participate in being itself in a particular and limited way, which means that they're caused by something else to be that way.
Right.
Which leads us... What's that, Red?
I was going to say, I usually add to that because they exist in that particular limited way, they differ with regard to their essence and their existence.
Yep, absolutely true. That's absolutely 100% true. But this does lead us to the maximum of the genus in the species. So just like how the fire is the maximum of the genus of heat in the house, so too God is the maximum and cause of the genus of being, if you want to call it that, in all of reality. For their goodness, for the nobility, for their truth, for their perfection. And so we come, interestingly enough, to a being which we can say is truth, goodness, beauty, nobility, oneness, thinghood itself, and that's what we call God.
Right.
And
what to Richard Dawkins' point though about the smelly feet?
What to Richard Dawkins' point about the smelly feet? Well, here's the thing. That is, I think, what you would call an accidental quality of being, and it's a secondary quality as well. And when it comes to secondary beings, secondary substances, number one, they only exist in some way by participating in a primary substance, and so stinkiness doesn't exist by itself. It exists in somebody's foot, but it still has existence. And so we can say that God is the cause of stinkiness, but only insofar not so much that he has stinkiness, because that's not a transcendental well-being. My cup doesn't stink. Not all things have the secondary quality of stinkiness. But he's the cause of it because it has being of some sort. But he's not the cause formally, you could say, because God himself doesn't stink.
Right. With the transcendentals, we're talking about things that are susceptible to being absolute, to being unlimited, right?
Yes.
When you talk about things like stinkiness, accidental qualities like that, you're not talking about something that's susceptible to unlimited absolute existence.
Yep.
And so those kinds of things wouldn't apply to God. You wouldn't say God is the most green, because green is not susceptible to unlimited existence in the way goodness, truth, beauty, perfection are.
Yep. Exactly. So I think this is a beautiful argument, and from these two things that I appreciate a lot more than the popular arguments that are often presented by people like William Lane Craig or Greg Koukl, both of whom I hold in the highest esteem, and I actually respect them quite a bit for the work that they've done in engaging the contemporary culture.
Craig is helpful at opening up the question. I mean, even if his arguments don't get us all the way to God, they show that materialism doesn't work, at least.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not going to reveal my source, but a friend of mine who has had some conversations with Craig, and this my friend is a PhD in philosophy as well, he has said that Craig isn't 100% sure where he's at with his metaphysics, but what his primary objective is to demonstrate that materialism does not hold. He doesn't want to get too far into some of the other nitty-gritty issues, like on realism or nominalism and those kind of debates. Yeah,
I think a lot of Craig's motivation in why he does philosophy the way he does is he has a particular biblical view, and that's a starting point.
Yeah, that's also largely an issue, which is a bit of a problem right now. It's really popular in many evangelical circles to reject the divine simplicity, which is one of the necessary conclusions that you have with Thomas's first through fifth ways. Actually, I think all of Thomas's arguments. And we don't have a ton of time to go into this right now, but they deny that God doesn't have any attributes or accidents. And part of the reason why they do that, if I'm understanding them correctly, is because they do start with the biblical hermeneutic of taking some of the things that are said about God in Scripture in a very literalistic manner, like when God changes his mind, or when he goes angry.
God is angry, or
which there's a lot of responses for that, and I think it'd be good to touch on divine simplicity and theistic personalism at some point. And part of the reason for that is I think that it makes God less loving, interestingly enough, because if you reduce God
less God too.
Yeah, there's that too. That's another problem. You're basically worshiping Zeus, the super Zeus.
Yeah.
But if you have this God who you can't really rely on because he's subject to change himself, then where's this love going to come from? But with the divine attributes that we get through Thomas's 5 ways, like the first mover, for example, or the fifth way. If God is, let's explain the fifth way. That's the argument from teleological causes in the universe, which is things ordered towards particular ends, and every end for a thing is its good.
Right.
And God is ordering all things towards their good, and love is acting towards the good of the other, then God is demonstrating love to all things by bringing them into existence and moving them towards their end.
And very briefly, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, and very briefly, if God is made up of parts, as they suggest, then he's dependent upon the parts.
Yes.
There's something prior to God, something greater than God, and God is not God. So divine simplicity is not like an option here for a Christian. Divine simplicity is a necessity for a Christian.
Yes, I completely agree. And there's a number of texts in sacred scripture as well that indicate this exact same conclusion. And there's a hermeneutical difference between people who subscribe to divine simplicity versus those who subscribe to theistic personalism. But I think that'd be good for another topic.
Sure.
But in conclusion here, I think considering the rapid advance of atheism or secularism or the mass exodus of people from believing in the faith as something that is reasonable, something that's worth their intellectual time, we really need a renewal of the Catholic intellectual tradition at every level in the Catholic Church, not just these abstract debates that we're having right now between theistic personalism and divine simplicity, and whether we should use Thomas's 5 ways or the ones that are presented by William Lane Craig and other personal or other more contemporary apologists. And I'd be very interested in the future having a guest on to talk about that exactly. And I think I know exactly who we're going to be inviting, but I'm not going to say it quite yet. We'll leave it to have all the listeners be in absolute suspense.
Keep them in suspense.
But do you have any last thoughts here, Chris?
Yeah, I would just say the following. If you're a Catholic who takes your faith seriously, there's several things that you need to have read in your life. One of them is Fides et Ratio by John Paul II.
Oh my gosh.
His famous encyclical on the importance of both faith and reason. We're not fideists. We don't believe in such a thing as blind faith. And so if you want to be truly formed as a Catholic, you need to have some kind of exposure to this intellectual tradition. You need to have some kind of understanding as how reason, just as much as faith, plays a role in our spiritual lives, both morally, theoretically, corporately, communally. If you don't have that, if you don't have that grounding, it's not just to say you're missing out on something, but you're missing out on something that God wants you to have. Knowing the truth by reason alone is part of our natural happiness on earth. God designed us that way. Aristotle, Thomas, the Church has argued that for centuries. And so not knowing the truth by reason, you're missing out on some of the perfection and some of the happiness that God has prepared for us.
Yes. And I'd add to that, too, Catholic educators need to learn how to express these truths in a way that is accessible to teens. I think we talked a little bit before about how they ask questions earlier. The thing is, they are capable of understanding many of the things that we talked about today. The second way and the first way and the fourth way are arguments that I've used with kids all the way down to 7th grade, and they've largely understood it, albeit with some difficulty, but it's made sense to them. Would they be able to repeat it right away? No, not necessarily. But after one hearing, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
No, and certainly not as quickly as we went over them here, but still doable.
Exactly, it's doable, and it doesn't necessarily require a deep investigation into Thomas's metaphysics. And part of the reason for that, another reason why I love Thomas, is that Thomas's metaphysics is simply accord with common sense, what we experience in the world around us. It just is more robust and is a more well thought out system of understanding how the world presents itself to us. And so I do want to encourage all religious educators out there to really take your vocation seriously and don't water down the faith. Give them the true wine of philosophy, or the water of philosophy, and then have the gospel transform it into wine, as Thomas talks about in the Summa. And you can do that through a number of the resources that we mentioned today. And if you have any questions about where else to go to try to learn how to present the faith in a compelling and accessible manner, you can email us at our email address, which is ned@wcatradio.com. One more time, that's ned@wcatradio.com. And for John Studi, Christopher Apodaca, and our missing co-host, Jacob Nelson, who will be back next week, this is The Lost Voice Radio, where we seek to recover the voice of wisdom and the voice of common sense which spoke to Socrates over 2,000 years ago, and see how it applies to our lives today. Thank you, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.